I would like to invite our distinguished guest, keynote speaker also, like Professor Park, Professor David Engels from the Institute of Western Affairs and from Uniwersytet Libre de Brussels. And the title is How the Lockdown Complexifies the Traditional Party Political Divisions in Europe. The screen is yours, Professor. Please, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you very much first, of course, for this kind invitation to our online conference. I'm looking very much forward to also the other presentations, to our discussion. Very happy to be here with you today. For many years, it seemed that the main political division in Europe would be between politically correct parties on the one hand and their populist opponents on the other, if you allow me to use these somewhat derogatory designations for the sake of facility. The fundamental ideological division ran along the lines of identity. For the former parties, identities are merely social constructions whose divisive force is considered as destructive for the well-being of communities. Thus, the traditional family is often associated with patriarchy, religious communities with intolerance, persecution, and so forth, the classical nation state with imperialism, colonialism, and so forth, and Western civilization as such with the arrogance of white supremacy. In order to destroy these identities, politically correct parties focus either on the individual being or on humanity as such. And in consequence, all political decisions have to be justified either by the protection of the former's or the latter's interest. Of course, the parties adhering to these convictions range from extreme leftist parties right into the middle of Christian democracy, and there are numerous shades and nuances to this program. Nevertheless, the recent years have shown a growing ideological fusion between these parties that is also ever more frequently acknowledged by themselves. On the other hand of the political spectrum, we find parties generally labeled as populists. In contrast to their enemies, they focus on collective identities as main agents of political interest and thus try to defend them against what they perceive as the dangers of relativism and universalism. Of course, they too are all but homogeneous, as some of them are rather in favor of a rationalist and liberal outlook on identity, while others focus on historical and, above all, religious values. It should also be noted that most populist parties are deeply divided within, as the official party programs are often enough just provisory and fragile compromises between individuals do not necessarily reflect a long-lasting ideological consensus beyond the fundamental opposition towards the established parties and their universalist ideology. Of course, identity is just one, though major factor differentiating the established parties from their populist opponents. Others are economics, education, social politics, the European Union, debt policy, and, above all, the orientation of Europe either towards the US or towards Russia. However, and this is the main point of my speech, this fundamental dichotomy of the European political party landscape has been deeply disrupted by the COVID crisis. At least in Europe, until 2020, it looked like the popular criticism of uncontrolled mass migration, of the increasing debts occasioned by the rescue of the euro, and of the fight against the growing competences of the European institutions had reached a tipping point where it could not be excluded that the populists might succeed in imposing some form of stalemate within the European political arena. Then, out of a sudden, the COVID crisis totally changed the situation. After some months of uncertainty and political flux, during which the media, as well as many parties, repeatedly changed their opinions as to the danger of the COVID pandemic and the best way to fight it, a new strategical situation arose that might give some hints as to the future of the political equilibrium in Europe. It would lead too far now to retrace the chronological evolution step by step and country by country. So let me just subsume some major results of this evolution. First, and most importantly, it has to be noticed that there is no fundamental difference in the assessment of the danger of COVID-19, the usefulness of lockdowns, and the need for mass vaccination in countries run by politically correct parties and in those run by populist parties. Thus, while Hungary and Poland, generally speaking, show no restraint in upsetting the public opinion of Western Europe when it comes to migration, LGBTQ, or media politics, their COVID policy is virtually identical to that of their politically correct Western neighbors. Secondly, as a corollary to this first point, we see that opposition parties, whether they are on the politically correct side of the spectrum in the East or on the populist side of the spectrum in the West, seemed overwhelmed by the new situation, which was entirely unexpected and wholly unrelated to their previous ideological positions. Thus, they lost the power of initiative and merely antagonized their respective governmental opponents, following rather than shaping public discourse. Thus, in the first phase, for example, the AfD in Germany or the Rassemblement National in France criticized their government for taking the COVID crisis not seriously enough, while the Polish PO did the contrary after the peace-led government decided to close the Polish border. In the second phase, when most governments aligned on a parallel course, the oppositions criticized them for not acting resolutely enough. Only in the third phase, after many months of lockdown, we see a slow shift towards some form of general criticism of the economic consequences of the lockdown and the insufficient preparation of hospitals. Now, when it comes to vaccination, criticism focuses not on its danger, but rather the missing efficiency with which it is implemented by the different governments. Third, the impressive display of state power in closing borders, imposing nationwide lockdowns, voting emergency powers, and controlling regulations through massive police presence has been beneficial for most governments in opinion polls. However, the lukewarm and somewhat inconsistent opposition to the COVID policy by the opposition has led to a relative decline in their credibility, as the potential political momentum had been largely lost at the beginning of the pandemic. Fourth, as no political party has dared to systematically relativize the danger of COVID and to underline, for example, the uselessness of lockdowns or the health risks of mass vaccination with experimental agents, many citizens have discovered that they were politically left on their own with their opinion. This gave rise to many spontaneous movements, such as the German Querdenker and many similar organizations abroad, often labeled as COVIDiots and associated with conspiracy theories or fake news. This newly emerging grassroots opposition, it should be noted, is politically very heterogeneous and combines voters from all political orientations, as could be seen in many manifestations throughout Germany and Europe. Now, unfortunately, precise statistical data is still missing. It seems clear that these demonstrations were attended from the extreme left up to the extreme right of the political spectrum, from extremely religious up to outright materialist citizens, and from unpolitical non-voters up to highly politicized conspiracy believers. What lessons can be learned from this situation and what consequences can we expect for the future? Once again, I would like to subsume this in a series of hypotheses. First, all political players have understood that even excessive displays of political power were not detrimental, but rather beneficial to their popularity. Opinion polls have shown that the harder they imposed anti-pandemic measures, the more popularity they usually enjoyed. After Europe had defended for many years the neoliberal ideal of the night watchman state, this new COVID-related evolution could inaugurate the return of the strong state, and thus the belief that a government, in case of doubt, better acts strongly and uses the entirety of state power than to hesitate and avoid taking risks. Second, during these last months, The political debate has significantly shifted from a narrative centered around the individual to a narrative organized around the well-being of the community, and from the respect of the constitution to the idea that the end hallows the means. Indeed, the increasing number of emergency laws and the bypassing of traditional institutions by makeshift informal councils and advisory boards have set many dangerous precedents. These could be used in many other political situations in the future, as is shown by the numerous appeals to apply COVID emergency rules onto other political situations and, for example, declare a climate emergency requiring dictatorial measures. Third, the dichotomy between political correctness and populism is slowly mutating into a dichotomy between the system and the rebellion, you could say. Some populist parties might be able to survive this mutation. Others could be replaced by new, more radical opposition movements. These oppositions will cease even more than before to be clearly structured ideological movements, as has already been shown by the ideological vagueness of the Yellow Vests in France or the Black Lives Matter movements in the US. But while they will be unable to organize themselves as formal political parties, they will represent the nucleus of makeshift masses of urban resistance, which could exert decisive influence on a short-term basis, but without representing a classical long-term electorate. Fourth, the mass media, because of their frequent shifts in the assessment of the COVID crisis and their growing instrumentalization by governments, have lost much of their credibility throughout Europe thanks to the COVID crisis. Falling sales, increasing financial dependency on state investments, and the nearly entirely left liberal ideological orientation have estranged the media from an ever larger public. This public, in its search for alternative information, often enough now falls prey to other forms of political manipulation and seems increasingly lost between contradictory statistics, international comparisons, and dubious fact checkers, strongly increasing the risks of political radicalization. I will leave it to the discussion to draw the necessary conclusions from this toxic combination between the popularity of the display of state power, the voting of unconstitutional emergency powers, the rise of widespread unpolitical systemic opposition, and the fading away of a diverse and nuanced media landscape. Let it just be said here that cross-cultural and diachronic comparisons suggest a high probability of long-term systemic political unrest and the risks of seeing a return of authoritarianism and of charismatic forms of government in the post-COVID future. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for very interesting findings and this political scientist's perspective on that issue. And as one of outcome as a more heterogeneous political spectrum in European politics. And this, especially for me, was very important as a classical opposition. Establishment opposition is under question in some problem to respond to new political environment and grassroots movements and activities. Thank you very much. And then after